Hi, Gwilym. How are you this fine morning? It's actually quite nice and sunny here.
Very well, thank you. Very well indeed. Enjoying all the podcasts we're doing at the moment.
Yeah, we're cramming a few in at the moment, aren't we? It's good. It's good.
So as a result, I actually thought of something to talk about when you say what's going on.
Oh, go on then.
Well, say what's going on.
What's going on, mate?
Funny you should ask, Lee. No, not not really. No, I was thinking it's actually very exciting. Did a real world seminar yesterday.
What, with people?
So with people in the room, and we very clever got all the IT going. So there were also people attending by webinar, and it was really good fun. And you were talking to a room where you got reactions. And then at the end, we did something really strange and traditional, which was we all clapped our hands together at the same time. And it was actually quite weird. I had to remind everyone to clap. I think everyone's forgotten how to do it now.
It wasn't spontaneous then. You had to actually say.
No. I said, ladies and gentlemen, if you remember, this is what we used to do at the end of events. But no, and then a few people, the ones who are obviously in the real world, not the ones who zoomed in, but the real world people, we had nibbles and drinks afterwards, and it was really quite pleasant. Didn't feel too risky health-wise. It was quite spaced out, and we're in a big airy space. We should do more of that kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, well, can't wait. Although you and I we've seen one another a couple of times now, haven't we? So it's almost like I know you're a real person.
Yeah, well, doing the podcast in the pub, or the pubcast, was particularly good fun, and we need to do that again. You get a massive live audience.
We need to get a big audience, don't we?
Everyone listening in, get in touch, come along, and join us in the Scotch egg bonanza that it was.
Lee Davis and Gwilym Roberts are the two IPs in a pod, and you are listening to a podcast on intellectual property, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys.
Anyway, speaking about having a real audience, today's podcast came about because people actually listened to previous podcasts. So that's quite cool, isn't it? So what happened? We had I think it was the vaccine podcast. I'm pretty sure it was the vaccine podcast. And on Twitter, we had a little bit of a CEPA and Science Council Twitter conversation about it. And the folk from the Science Council said, hey, could we get some of our people back on to talk about other stuff? And we thought, yeah, that's a cracking idea. So it shows that the podcast's going out to a wider audience than just our patent attorneys, etc. And isn't that great about the way social media works? Someone can kind of drop you a tweet and away you go. And here we are. So today, off the back of that conversation with the Science Council, we are going to have a little look at, I'm probably going to get this entirely wrong, and I'll rely on my guests to correct me, but let me have a go at it. We're going to have a look at a project which has examined the role of intellectual property in accelerating sustainable transitions. So we're going to find out all about that. We've got two of the project leads with us today. We've got Frank Tietze, who is an old friend of the podcast. Frank's been on before, and Elisabeth Eppinger. So welcome both. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, if that's okay, because you know yourselves better than I do. So let's start with Elisabeth, shall we, just to get a new voice on at the start. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So Elisabeth Eppinger is my name. I'm in Germany, based in Berlin, at the University of Applied Science of Technology and Economics. And I'm leading this interdisciplinary research project where we really bring together scientists from University of Cambridge, Frank Tietze, and colleagues, and the Indian Institute of Science, Angela Gurto and her team members, and the Freie University in Berlin, Carsten Dreher, and also from Lund University, Lars Drupeit and colleagues. And we really set out to research and to investigate how businesses actually make use of intellectual property to bring sustainable solutions to the market.
Fantastic. Before we get Frank to introduce himself, can I just ask a question about that many people from that many locations? How have you found bringing all of those people together, given where we've been with the pandemic?
We started before the pandemic, and we were actually very lucky to meet in person also a couple of times before the pandemic. And it was really a combination of different researchers we know before, and then we met, and suggestions brought forward by others. So but we were lucky to start before.
Has the work been carrying on in an online world? You've carried on Zoom and stuff like that, I'm imagining.
Yeah.
And you found that's worked okay?
It's okay. It's okay. It's doable. I think it would be much better to actually meet in person again, and it's just easier to discuss and analyze things if you're in one room together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Frank, reintroduce yourself to us. We've met you before, but tell us something new about you. Talk about the project.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back, Lee and Gwilym. As Elisabeth said, this is a 3-year project, and I'm the project lead here for the UK and based in Cambridge at the engineering department. So I haven't moved around since we did the last podcast. I'm still based in Cambridge. And it's really been really fantastic that when we kind of had the idea for this project, I think Elisabeth and I recall we had a conversation while we attended a conference in New York. This was pre-pandemic, many years ago. Imagine you could travel at that time. Wasn't that great? So yeah, we really had this idea of doing a project that really kickstarts research that focuses on IP and sustainability together. And this is really something that has been a bit of a niche area, but obviously with discussions and the need to doing something about climate change and reduce carbon emissions and so on, we really thought this is really something we got to do and we got to kick off. So we were really happy. It was a tough competition. I think there were 150 or so proposals being put into the Belmont Forum, but we were really lucky we got this one project, Elisabeth said, with colleagues from India, Sweden, Germany, UK, all together. And this has been running now for quite a while. And the pandemic had its impact. It hit us. I recall sitting here in my office waiting for the taxi to pick me up for our meeting in India, and like 2 hours before the taxi was about to arrive, the meeting was cancelled. And our India meeting with all the advisory board, we have a really large group. It's, as Elisabeth said, interdisciplinary. We have IP folks, but we have also really top academic colleagues who understand sustainability. And I don't think there's ever been a project like this before that brings together these two groups of people. And as you guys know, already IP is interdisciplinary. It's got legal issues. It's always, let's say, particular patterns is about technology. You've got always business issues involved, and then you suddenly bring in sustainability. So it's quite a complex endeavor, but it's been fun so far. The pandemic really kicked in when we wanted to do our data collection, when we wanted to actually do interviews with businesses to learn how they use IP and how it links to sustainability. So it hasn't been easy, but we've come through this, and now we have all the data, we're analyzing it, and we're seeing the results emerging.
Fantastic, and hopefully you're going to share some of that with us today.
We might.
You might. So have you been looking at all intellectual property rights, patents, trademark, copyright, design, or has it focused mainly on invention and patents?
We basically looked at all intellectual property rights, but the main focus, I would say, is on patents and trade secrets in this discussion. But usually a product or a technology is covered by a bundle of different intellectual property rights. So because our focus was more on how a sustainable solution, like a new product or a technology, gets invented and then brought to the market, what kind of collaborations are taking place. So from this perspective, it doesn't make really sense to look only at one particular IPR, but to look at the bundle that needs to, like in technology transfer, where you cannot just throw a patent over the fence and say, well, do something with it, but where you really need to get also some trade secrets, some other IP as a whole package.
And if I could add to that, so the way how we look at it, we look at the kind of ownership issues, and that's about basically, if you want, so the creation of these IP rights, but also including trade secrets and know-how. But then we're particularly also looking at how it's being used, and that links to licensing, as Elisabeth mentioned, collaboration. Lots of technologies that we need for a more sustainable world are not developed by individual companies, or if they are developed in research groups, they typically get spin out, and then maybe companies merge or get acquired and all of that. So there's a lot of collaboration, tech transfer involved. So we distinguish basically in that project between, or often we distinguish between the ownership creation and then the usage. And usage, we often look at sharing models. We distinguish between in-sharing and out-sharing, in-licensing, out-licensing. And we look at different degrees of how open different companies are. Do they basically create their IP internally through own R&D and then just keep it secret, which we consider as the closest form, or do they actually collaborate with others where they need to share some IP? Either they bring in some IP that is developed by others, or they outshare their IP. This could be patented technologies, but as Elisabeth said, we also have some interesting cases where companies have used, for instance, trademarks in quite a clever way, and we can come back to that later. I just wanted to make one point I forgot in the introduction. We have a website for the project, and that's www.ip and then 4 as the number 4 sustainability.org. So there's a lot of information, and there are some knowledge briefs. There are linked to papers. Already quite a lot, and we're going to put some business tools and some teaching material there over the coming months, which some people might hopefully find interesting, and everybody's encouraged to use that material.
That sounds a fantastic resource. What we'll do, Frank, is we'll make sure that the link goes out with the text about the podcast.
Would be great.
I was going to ask an early question, and just for the benefit of the our guests today, you've probably guessed from the name of the podcast that we're not exactly anti-IP, but I always think it's important to ask, the anti-IP questions as well as the pro-IP questions to flush it out. So we're talking about sustainability, which is an incredibly important goal for so many reasons, and we're talking about technological developments that can help with our efforts to make the planet a more sustainable entity. Obviously, IP is fundamentally an exclusive right, which is designed to permit individuals to have a monopoly over the technology they developed. So do we have an immediate tension between the IP system and the goal of developing shareable, sustainable technology?
I can go first here. It reminds me a bit about the conversation we had about COVID in the previous podcast, where we also talked about vaccine patents and so on. And I think I made a similar point there that while you're right, they are exclusive rights, they also, however, IP rights assign ownership rights, right? And it doesn't mean because it's an exclusive right that company actually needs to exercise that as an exclusive right. So there are ways to share your IP and to give others access to it. And I think that's probably something that may have to be understood better. And this morning, I was thinking a little bit about this podcast, and I thought maybe in the future, we should see the Licensing Executive Society and SEPA joining forces, because it is not just about exercising that exclusivity, but kind of thinking about how others can use that. So just by the nature of the patent system, it does not prevent any owners of the IP to make it available to others, right? So that is not a problem. That is not prohibited by the law. It just, from the outset, it's IP rights assign these ownership rights, and then it is up to the owners to decide what you want to do. But maybe, Elisabeth, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to that, because this is a discussion that we would like to contribute to. When we started the project, we actually saw from the sustainability community always a request to keep it open and open source, open licensing, open access, open whatever. And from a more traditional economic perspective, no, you need some kind of incentives, some kind of lead time advantages, head starts, so that you can recoup your investments that you, as a business, that you take, and also to attract investors. If you invent something and it's novel, and the infrastructures and whole value chains need to change, then of course it comes also with a lot of investments. So there is definitely a tension between keeping it to yourself as a business, and the like more businesses needing it in order to change certain manufacturing practices or certain products. And we see this tension also exactly in our cases. They're very aware that for certain products, certain technologies, it's absolutely necessary that it's accessible to all players, all stakeholders in a given industry. But when it comes to their own developments and innovation activities, they say, well, we need some kind of guarantee or some mechanism that helps us to recoup some of the investments. So there is a tension. And I think the tension will stay with the world at least for the next decades.
And if I can pick up what Elisabeth said, we've been working on a framework which is more of an academic exercise, but during that project, and something that we knew before, but that is an essential element of that framework is we look at we call them IP models because they are not really IP strategies. So in a sense, we rather say an IP strategy is a combination of these different models. But those different models, they stretch from completely closed IP models to completely open IP models. And what Elisabeth mentioned, the open access, open source models, they are actually on a more towards the end of the very open models. The very open models are the ones where you actually have old expired IP that is really available in the public domain. And you could think about here patents that are older than 20 years, that can't be renewed anymore, that have been expired. That technology is in the public domain and can be picked up by everyone. On the other complete extreme are actually the trade secrets, where it is IP that has not been registered. So it sits within the companies. And we must not forget that one of the original reasons why a patent system was set up was to incentivize innovation, as Elisabeth said, but it's also about to actually the deal that the patent system kind of encourages. It encourages companies to actually turn their trade secrets into patents. They get, as an exchange from the state, from the patent offices, they get a monopoly right for a certain period of time. But at least the trade secrets are opened up and put into writing. Now, we all know there's some strategic behaviors by some actors, and while patents require replicability, not everything is always written into the patents, and that's very difficult to control for. But we should not forget that already a patent is a slightly open form of basically of IP, because it sits in the public domain. It's exclusive to the owner for a certain period of time, but at least others can read about it, they can access it, they can kind of potentially take out a license if the owner wants to give out a license. So the patents are not the closest form of IP, actually. Thank you.
And a comment I mean, open source is a lovely concept, and if the whole world was sort of perfectly nice people, it would be brilliant, but reality isn't quite like that. And I've always felt that the IP side of it kind of keeps people honest, and as you say, Elisabeth, kind of plays to the human nature, the need for incentive to do stuff. But I think we all like a bit of tension, don't we? I think it's actually quite good to have the tension between the two things. It's a realistic reflection of some basic human impulses, the one to be nice and the one not to be nice. So I think finding that balance, yeah. And
Gwilym, also open source is about copyright, right? In most cases, in some countries, there might be some patent protected software behind it. But then it's also about which license do you choose? And we all know there are different types of open source licenses, some that are really progressive, and they also force the users of that open source piece of software to make their code available open source. And then again, that is on the very end of the spectrum of being very open. But then there are also more restricted open source licenses. And it's also known that the copyright is given up for most open source projects. So there is an element of ownership, similar to as you recall in the previous podcast, we talked about the Open COVID Pledge, right? Open COVID Pledge also means that the owners of the patents maintain the ownership, but just they allow others to use the IP without kind of being sued for infringement. So we should not forget that actually also in the economic system, that allocation of ownership rights, whether it's copyright or patents, is actually not too bad, because it also means those who want to use a certain piece of software or patent, they know who to approach. Now, there are problems in the patent system that ownership is often not very transparent, particularly if patents get sold or transferred to others, and that's not recorded in the patent system. We don't know how that will work out in the future, but I would certainly say from a sustainability perspective, it would be very helpful if there would be, the actual ownership would be more transparent. So those who want to pick up a certain technology to build on it, as we know, often innovation is cumulative, then they would know who to approach and actually say, can we take out a license? And maybe policymakers could facilitate a little bit of the incentives to give out licenses in some cases to support sustainability. That wouldn't be too bad.
Brilliant. Lee, I'm done with the philosophy. Over to you.
I was wondering when you'd be done. Can I just roll us back a wee bit, if that's okay, to help me understand, and also the listeners understand, the way the project works. Now, I know there are going to be all sorts of confidentiality agreements in place so that you can't tell us who's taken part in this, but I was wondering if you could give us a flavour of the types of technologies that have been involved, and also the nature of the companies. Are these multinationals? Are these small local startups? What have the participants look like?
Yeah, so we targeted businesses like a combination of multinationals and more local companies. But one requirement was that they need to have a successful technology or product on the market for a few years, depending if it's a high-tech solution or a low-tech solution. So for high-tech, it should be proven for 5 years at minimum, so that the business really qualifies as something that can bring something to the market. And in terms of industry sectors, so we got some from energy, renewable energy sector, but also chemical industry, recycling industry, material sciences, consumer electronics. Yeah. And we also, in terms of geography, so we cover some from India and also a lot of cases from Europe, because the majority of our partners are based in Europe, but also from the United States and Australia, we have examples. However, I must say this is really when it comes down to their headquarters, when you talk about multinationals, but also how they are connected in their value chains. So their suppliers, or most of them are in B2B business, so they're also their customers, and their supply chains are also in other Asian countries and African countries. So it's,
In fact, we do have UK companies as well.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
We still call them European.
It's part of. We still consider them part of European, but it was mentioning that.
Hey, we've not left a continent. I've lost my train of thought now. I can't remember where I was going next with the next question.
Talk about the meaning of life again, Lee, or are we good?
The meaning of IP and the necessity of IP. But I wanted to add to what Frank was explaining, that with all the tension, we know that we will always get into the discussion, is IPRs, are patents necessary or not? Is it a good or a bad thing? So maybe what's also important to know is that with our project, we kind of wanted to move this discussion forward to look at what we have and what can you actually do with it to accelerate sustainability transitions. Yeah, so we know that the patent system will stay around, the copyright system as well. We don't think that it will disappear in the next decades. So how can you actually use intellectual property rights, and also from a policy perspective, how should you incentivize and regulate that businesses, organizations use it in the best interest.
And did you find that the companies that were participating, did they already have a perspective on how IPRs play a part in increasing sustainability, or were they really only looking at IPRs from the perspective of competitive advantage or income generation?
Maybe just to add there two things. So going back just a little bit to also mention that we are also not in the whole project, we're not only looking at environmental sustainability, but we're also looking at social sustainability. So we're looking at this triple bottom line concept: economic, environmental, and social impact for our case companies. And I also wanted to say, and that goes a bit to your question, is that what we've certainly seen is that some companies who really started out doing, let's say, recycling technologies for plastic, they have filed for patents to also attract investment. And so one way how we picked these cases was we were looking at the European Inventor Award, and they have some companies they have awarded these prizes to. So that is a kind of first start that some companies are really only able to attract investment and to get this going. In similar as in other industries and sectors, they actually are technicians that want to develop a technology that helps with recycling or with filtering the air, reducing energy consumptions, and they file for patents for that to get a business started.
Yeah, and maybe to add to your question, Lee, we actually found both approaches. Yeah, a very traditional use of using it really as a tool to get investors to protect, to recoup their investments. But we found also examples. Usually they are not startups anymore. They are already established by definition. But businesses who started more around the 2000 with a really strong sustainability mission. So they also started more with an idea of how to actually use intellectual property, and they go for a more open, more sharing approach. And there's even one example which was founded in the 70s, and back then already deliberately decided, like in the chemical industry, and back then already decided that they do not want to protect any invention because their mission is really to contribute to environmental sustainability in the chemical industry. And they do want to actually share it also with what you would usually call competitors. They don't really perceive them as competitors, but more as stakeholders who are in the same boat and who should also use certain substances, certain processes.
So I would agree. I mean, obviously, based on the same project, same results. So what should I say? No, I mean, to add to that, that's what we're seeing is that there's often a different perception of what a competitor means or what competitive advantage means. Some of these companies are more mission driven, and they really want to achieve something. So we have seen, for instance, an electricity company that is really was started as a mission driven company to really promote green electricity production and production, and they have used, for instance, the trademark very strategically to also try and convince other stakeholders in the electricity value chain or ecosystem to push that a little bit more, that kind of green thinking. And they've decided to only work with partners who share a similar philosophy, and with them they kind of cross-license their trademark, so they allow them to use their trademark, which has been becoming a really strong brand that is really associated with trusted sustainability. And as Elisabeth said, that we probably see a little bit more of a tendency that these green sustainable companies that we've been investigating, that they are more open to share their IP, but they are not necessarily not filing for any patents because they see this as a complete contradiction. We've seen some cases where the founders were kind of like really sustainability pioneers, but they also at some point started filing patents. They started off, going back to that electricity example, that company, for instance, started off with being focused on trademarks, and then later on also filed a few patents. So it's, but there's this maybe a bit more of a tendency to at least be more willing to share their IP. But there are also cases where companies strategically decide to not share their IP, their patents, with certain partners. Like, as I said, in that electricity ecosystem, that company would not allow another company to use their trademark if it wouldn't comply with their sustainability values. And it's that selective behavior that comes out quite prominently in the project.
Is any of the data surprising you? Are there things that you're finding that you didn't expect to find?
That's a good question.
that's the tumbleweed question.
I think to take the slightly different, I found this really fascinating because that hasn't been, we are not aware of any study that has really looked into those companies before. And there's been a lot of speculation. So what we're doing with our project, we're providing some evidence here that how sustainability companies think about IP. And I would definitely say that some of the stories we heard are really fascinating. Now, whether this is completely surprising, I'm not so sure, but I often, maybe being an academic, I would just find this really interesting. If a company talks to me and shares with me their thinking about what they are trying to achieve in terms of their sustainability goals and how they want to push their frontier and get others to think more sustainability, and at the same time how they are trying to use IP. And these links between are really difficult to like uncover and really establish causality. Is there really a link between this patent being filed and suddenly this company being more sustainability? It's a really tough question, but we do have some really good stories. And the one of the cases that I very much like is more of a social sustainability company, more of a humanitarian approach. They've developed highly nutritional food for malnourished children and pregnant women in Africa. And that kind of, that case particularly reminds me that we need to mention another thing here, which is our third component of the project, which is the business model. So we're looking at the three components: the IP, the sustainability impact, and the business model that these companies choose. And this company has deliberately chosen a business model where they said, well, we want to obviously make money, but we also want to make money by actually creating local jobs in Africa and really creating long-lasting sustainable impact by creating local jobs in different sub-Saharan or less developed countries. It's actually not only Africa. So low and middle income countries, they wanted to create local jobs there. And what they have done is they have developed this product, they've patent protected it, and then they are licenses that for very low fee as a kind of franchising business to basically entrepreneurs who want to set up a business in a country and use local resources, local materials, train local people, create local jobs, and thereby establish and build local factories. So this company that transfers this IP, which also involves a lot of know-how, process know-how that is not patent protected, but is more of a confidential know-how. At the same time, because of this business model, and this is their mission, this is what they want to achieve, they've deliberately tried to use the patents to avoid price competition by actually not licensing out that IP and these patents to large manufacturers who could possibly produce the products cheaper and just basically swamp the market with cheaper products, because that's not what they want. Their mission is to really create an upskill, create jobs and sustainable, healthier living in poor countries, basically. And I find that story really fascinating. Now, is that really kind of new and interesting? I don't know, but I think this is the story worth telling.
So it's interesting. I mean, you've mentioned you've got views on the role of IP and that it can be used positively, and you identified a whole different range of kind of business types that you're looking at, and you've talked about some examples you've discovered that clearly they excited you. They sound fantastic. You're very enthusiastic about it. Out of interest, this project is, I think, as you've described it, as a study, I think. But what kind of outcome are you looking for? What would success look like at the end of this project? Are you going to be giving some guidance to businesses about how this can work?
Yes. So one of the output is for businesses. We are currently working on a workbook, something short, digestible for businesses, and so we put together different examples of how to actually use IPR to increase sustainability impact, how that can be also used in sustainability reporting. I think the heart of this workbook is really some questions and templates to help businesses to think about their IP. How do they use it currently, and what would happen if they share it, or if they use it differently, if they use specific sharing licensing approaches? Can they then increase the impact that they achieve? Because a lot of businesses, they spend money on all sorts of activities, but licensing and sharing that usually comes along with a lot of resources that you need to do it properly. And especially the medium-sized businesses, when you talk to them, they often, the willingness to share it with others is there. So they would be happy because they know as well they cannot cover the whole world with their product and technologies, so they are happy to share it, but they just don't know with whom and when and how to look for these partners. So in terms of triggering this thought to do this more actively, to me that would be a really good outcome. So with the output, this workbook that we want to achieve, and we also want to contribute to the discussions in sustainability policies, because so far the idea of licensing, different licensing approaches and IP models is discussed very frequently when it comes to health crisis. A lot of politicians and scientists are talking about the climate crisis now for decades. And the amount of different IP sharing approaches, mechanisms that you see for health issues and health crisis is really, very rich. And also a lot of organizations are very active there. But when it comes to environmental sustainability, climate change crisis, it's, very quiet, I would say, and there are not a lot of approaches and interesting models that you see. So I hope another really good outcome would also to contribute to sustainability, to environmental sustainability and the different IP models and approaches there.
Yeah, and as we know, I mean, IP underpins a lot of the business activities that runs in economies, also the more informal IP. And as Elisabeth said, the policy debate is something that we're really trying to facilitate. So if you look at the COP26 that is happening soon in the UK, up in Glasgow, if you look at that agenda, there's a bit about knowledge transfer, and IP is part of that. But IP doesn't have that prominence that it ought to have in the discussions about climate change. So we're trying to push the policy debate, and we will be putting out policy briefing documents when we have all the results. But also, IP is always about education. I think, we in general, besides the specific focus on sustainability, we still have a lot to do to educate younger people, but also executives about what IP actually is and how it can be used. And we're also putting together teaching packs that we hope other academics will use in their teaching at universities. Those teaching packs, as well as the workbook, will include case studies. And so we're addressing basically the policy level, the businesses, but also the educational sector with the outcomes of this project.
Do you have a timeline for publication? Is there? I'm imagining that the educational resources and the toolkits will come out over time, but can you give us an idea of when we can start to see things?
Of course not. That's all secret. We're a very close project team. No, it's fairly straightforward in the sense that the project got extended because it got delayed because of COVID, but the project should finish in May next year. So at the moment, we're working hard. We're working on some academic papers that basically bring together the actual results from all the case studies. We're working on a policy framework. So it should be over the coming months. Maybe not everything will be finished by May, but don't tell that our funding bodies. It might take a little while, but of course, we're very keen to get that out because the project is so close to our heart. That we really think this is an important topic, and we're also working on further funding proposals to get new projects started based on the work that we have already done now in the IPEX project.
No, that sounds really exciting. Well, Elisabeth, Frank, thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your experience of the project so far. You must make us a promise, though. Actually, I'm going to ask you to make us a couple of promises. First of all, I think when you publish, there would be a place for a discussion on this in the CEPA journal so that we can get UK IP professionals involved in it. So please think of us when it comes to publication. If there is some way we can help you in terms of publishing that internally within CEPA to get the professionals talking about it. And also I'm thinking there's probably scope for a future webinar to share it with members. So again, let's have a conversation nearer the time and see if we can't widen the audience that way as well. But thank you for the insight today. It's been fantastic. You were great guests. Gwilym, you were all right as usual. Bye now.